Hello again, students. Just want to give you a few brief points to bear in mind while you're reading this week's textbook chapter selection, Chapter 9. And Chapter 9 is obviously all about economic growth in the longest term. And we've already talked about economic growth quite a bit, right? Looking at GDP back in Unit 2 and its phenomenon of going through growth and recession, ups and downs that occur periodically, what we call the business cycle. What you're going to see in this chapter is sort of a discussion of why the economy grows in the first place. In other words, why is it that the periods of economic growth are usually stronger than the recessions, periods of economic shrinking, basically. And the fundamental reasons for long-run economic growth ultimately derive from productivity, right? So the question really isn't having overall growth just in production of goods, growth in GDP, because after all, we can achieve that just by having more people, right? So if you have a growing population or immigration into your economy, that will tend to increase the number of human beings and the number of hands that can be put to the wheels, so to speak, and that will increase production, but that won't increase living standards, that is to say GDP per capita. That's how we typically measure the variable. And to do that, to have more goods and services per person to consume, you're going to need to have people producing more goods and services per person. More goods and services per people to consume, you need to have more goods and services produced by people. And that's productivity. It refers to the amount of production, the value of production from your workforce in some period of time. And that is one thing to bear in mind. If you're coming from a business program perspective, productivity is often discussed in terms of sort of individual terms. Like your individual productivity is up, or Johnson, your department's productivity is down by 10%, something along those lines. In macro, we're looking at these national accounts, productivity refers to the total production of all the labor force in the U.S. economy. So imagine everyone in the United States is at their workstations ready to go and waiting, and then someone shoots a starter's pistol in the air and everyone works for 1 hour. After that, everyone stops and we add up the total value of everything we've produced. That's overall national productivity. Okay, so it's a slightly different concept. But then, of course, we're saying this productivity increases over time. That's why we have more GDP and more GDP per capita. Then the question is, where's this productivity coming from? Why should the workforce become more and more productive over time? Well, that's a big focus of Chapter 9 in your textbook. And the basic version of it is you've got 3 principal factors that drive productivity growth. And you'll see these discussed in your textbook. And some of them are ideas we've seen before. So physical capital, increased amounts, that is, of physical capital per worker can increase productivity. Right? If you're working on a farm and you're growing some agricultural crop using your bare hands, digging holes in the soil and planting crops, you'll have a certain low level of productivity. But if you're then able to use a stick to drag through the soil, or even have a pack animal, say in a metal plow, that animal can pull, that can significantly increase your level of productivity getting that farm work done, because now you have some capital. Okay, so the increasing amounts of capital per worker are one factor that increases productivity. But another one is a related idea that you're seeing for the first time here in Chapter 9, human capital, which sounds pretty creepy, right? I've created a factory made out of men, human capital. It's slightly less creepy than that. Human capital just refers to the increasing productivity of your labor, of your workforce, as they get more trained, more educated, or accumulate more work experience. That's human capital. All right? And for that can come from a variety of places. It can come from time on the job. It can come from basic education too, right? So a workforce tends to be more productive if it's capable of reading, because that allows it to read manuals and learn how to use the new capital that you're giving to it, the new physical capital. People are more productive if they can add numbers. That's a true fact. And this is one reason that education is important in a market economy. It's one of the reasons why we have a public sector, is to provide things like human capital on the most basic level of literacy and understanding of how the world works, so that then the private sector private sector workplace can train them on new equipment. And of course, that's the easiest way to understand human capital, right? Whenever you get new equipment or a new software program at your job, the first thing they do is train you on it, right? Exactly. So there's that factor contributing to growth. As your workforce gains more human capital, it can be more productive. And finally, third factor behind productivity gains is technology. Technology. And here, of course, we're referring mainly to technology that has a role in the production of goods and services, right? So this would be not so much giving you more capital, but giving you better capital. So going back to the example of working on a farm, we gave you some physical capital so you didn't have to work with your bare hands anymore. Well, now we're giving you, instead of a pack animal like an ox or a donkey and a metal plow, maybe now we'll give you better capital, more technologically sophisticated capital, like, say, a large modern tractor, or a large industrial combine. The further away you can get from a mule, the better in enterprise. But that's the point. Okay, with more capital, more physical capital, some human capital to train you how to use it properly, and giving you fancier capital as well with newer technology that produces more effectively. Those are the three fundamental drivers of growing labor productivity. And that ultimately is where growth in GDP per capita can come from, and potentially where standard of living gains across the economy can come from. It's not guaranteed we'll all get a share of rising GDP, but it is possible. But it's definitely not possible if there's no growth in the economy. So growth in productivity is definitely essential if there's going to be improvement in human standards of living at any time. So that's the kind of significance of this chapter and the material in it. It gives you a basic suggestion of how it is that we've reached the point with our economy that our kids can hope, at least, to have a higher standard of living than we did, can pass on a at least economically superior world to our kids than we enjoyed. Now, of course, lately people are more skeptical about that because our labor market has encountered some serious problems, which we will be talking about later on in the course once we get these basics out of the way. Okay, so those are your basic drivers of productivity. Your book spends a fair amount of time in the midsection of this chapter driving home a pretty simple point, which you should see pretty quickly, which is that you need to have growth in all of these contributors to productivity in order to have real growth in production and productivity. In other words, if I want to make my workforce more productive, I can't just give you more physical capital and walk away and expect you to be more productive, right? First thing that happens when you get new physical capital is you get trained on it and educated in how it works, so you get human capital to go with your new, more technologically sophisticated physical capital. And it's a pretty simple point. The textbook spends a lot of time discussing the diminishing returns to physical capital, which just says if we hold the other productivity drivers constant, so if we don't give you any more human capital or any new technology, but just keep giving you more and more and more physical capital, you get less and less out of that in terms of growth and production, which is very logical, right? So if you're in your workplace and I give you a computer to use and train you on it, you will be able to be more productive because of your new human and physical capital. On the other hand, if I want you to be more productive, I can't just give you 5 computers and expect you to be 5 times as productive, especially if human capital is held constant and I don't even train you how to use these things. All right? Pretty simple point there, I guess. So that shouldn't be too tough for you to deal with. It's an interesting section. Maybe the other big thing to anticipate on this week's quiz would be the issue of the Rule of 70. Rule of 70, which you'll find also in Chapter 9. The Rule of 70 is just a real simple mathematical tool that you can use to estimate the amount of time it will take for some variable that you're looking at to double in size. How long will it take some variable to double in size? It's very easy to use. You'll see it in Chapter 9. You simply take the number 70 and divide it by the annual growth rate of whatever phenomenon you're looking at. And usually we're looking at real GDP, right? So suppose real GDP is growing at 3.5% a year, okay, 3.5%, a normal, healthy growth rate. All you need to do to find how many years it will take our economy to be double the size it's at now is to take the number 70 and divide by 3.5. Okay, so it's a 3.5% growth rate. For the rule of 70, you divide the number 70 by like the numerical amount, the digital amount, the regular percentage amount of the growth rate. So 3.5%, you divide 70 by 3.5, not 0.035, which is what would normally be correct, right? So you avoid your correct mathematical instincts here to decimalize. And so if I give you a 3.5% growth rate, say how long till this economy doubles, you'll take the number 70, divide by the number 3.5. That should give you 20 years, if I'm thinking right. Okay, but that's a very, very simple type of problem. There's no trick to it other than avoiding the decimalization issue. And that makes for some easy quiz problems. So you can expect that on this week's quiz, which will go up in a day or two. And that should be good for your guidance on Chapter 9. After this, we'll look at where the investment comes from, the private sector investment that drives the growth of physical capital in the workplace, very important. But of course, the other two drivers, human capital and technology, research and development in technology, mainly come from the public sector. Bear in mind that while companies in the private sector, businesses, they do R&D, research and development, the development of new technologies. Typically it's applied research and development, whereas the most basic fundamental R&D, basic research, it's usually done by the public sector, by some sort of government or government-supported enterprise, whether that's the university system and the schools, or through the national research institutes, like the National Institutes of Health, or through the Pentagon. So take the thing that's allowing us to talk right now, right, the Internet. Well, the Internet, you may know, was originally referred to as DARPANET, DARPA network, after the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the Department of Defense, the Pentagon's main research agency. And they developed it so that scientists could share data sets about weapons results and basic scientific work they were doing. And then gradually it became commercialized and people realized you could watch porn on it, and that's how the Internet was born, right? But it was ultimately a public sector technology. Once it became commercially viable, it became available and firms began using it, and Bill Gates can use technology, could develop technology to make it commercially available on PCs in all of our homes, but only once the basic research had been done with R&D. And that's true for a lot of big scientific innovations lately. Computers were developed almost entirely through the university system and MIT. Modern things like global shipping, what we call containerization, developed almost entirely by the U.S. Navy to fight World War II on the opposite sides of two oceans, right? Standardized system of shipping containers. Now, that's the basis of the whole globalized economy. So for better or worse, our basic R&D, research and development, mostly comes from the public sector. Pharmaceutical companies, high-tech firms can do the applied research once that basic work is done. It's because science is a very unpredictable and expensive, very capital-intensive enterprise. Governments are better at it. They don't need to meet an immediate quarterly profit projection to satisfy the equity holders. That just means that they're better, the government, that is, public sector universities and research agencies. They're better suited at doing research because it's a long-term enterprise, takes a long time, and you don't know how long it's going to be until you make a discovery or develop some new engineering technique or technology that'll be of value. And certainly you don't know how long it'll be until it's commercially profitable to develop. So bear in mind, human capital and technology research are fundamentally public goods. There's definitely a private contribution, of course, to both of those. But physical capital, the buildup of that is almost entirely a private sector phenomenon. And you'll learn about that next week in Chapter 10. Okay. So this week, enjoy Chapter 9, and of course this week's more critical film, The Corporation, which you have a YouTube link to, which I've checked, it still works properly, which is a rare thing online these days. So take a look at that, and you can talk about experiences that you've had relative to the material in this week's lessons on the discussion boards, and we'll see you there.